welcome to Arts Westchester's virtual arts workshops. My name is Lana Yu. I'm an artist and an Arts Westchester teaching artist. Today I want to introduce to you the ancient technique of rubbings. A rubbing is simply the reproduction of an object or texture by placing a substrate such as paper or cloth over it and then rubbing pigment over it to transfer the design or texture. It's a really amazing thing to watch happen. That can be a little bit messy, but a lot of fun. It's a great art technique. And I read actually that it goes back as far as the 2nd century, where the Chinese would make rubbings of ancient Confucian texts that were incised in stone. And they did this as a way to disseminate or spread the information. So you can see it can be a very powerful tool of communication. Today I want to introduce it to you as an art form, as a way to add texture and shape into your art. It can also be an art unto itself. So let's get started.
So first off, you're going to want to gather some substrate or paper or some kind of cloth or material that you can make the rubbing with. So you already have some sketch paper. Also, I happen to have rice paper, which you don't have to have, but if you have it around, that's a really nice material to use as well. Here's some ordinary craft paper that's used for wrapping packages. You could also use brown paper bag. You could just cut up an old, brown paper bag from the supermarket. And I happen to also have this old sheet that I use as a drop cloth. And this can actually be torn, just ripped into segments. And you can see I did an example of one here. This is just a sheet that was used, or a segment of a sheet rather, to make a rubbing. Next you're going to want to gather some pigment that you can use to make the rubbings. I'm going to suggest either graphite, maybe you have some pencils lying around, or chalk, charcoal. I happen to have all these different colored pastels, so I'm going to be using that today. And I also gathered some things from the kitchen that I thought might complement the rubbing, just to add another dimension. You can see, you might recognize some of these materials. These are coffee grinds. I also have turmeric, cinnamon, and black pepper, as well as a tea bag that can be broken open and used in sort of a dampened form. And that will all lend kind of a brownish tinge to your art if you want to try to use natural pigments, which is a fun thing to experiment with, and much cheaper than art supplies and more environmental actually, so I want to encourage you to do that. The next thing we're going to gather are some objects that we actually want to use for the rubbing. And this is the really fun part, because you can start to scavenge around your home for what you might have. I gathered a few things here. These are some everyday objects that I've gathered around the house that you might also have. You might recognize what some of these objects are. And while they look quite mundane, I'll show you how they can be transferred to your paper to create a very unique texture. Another very popular material to use are leaves. So these were gathered from the garden earlier today. Mesclun greens. They get a little wilted, so you might want to actually put them in water. If you have access to outdoor space in your own garden, you can clip your own, or maybe go into the woods, or if you're in a park, or there's some leaves that have fallen around your home. See what you might find. I happen to be growing sweet potatoes, so here's some sweet potato vine, some Chinese mustard greens. And we're going to use the back side of the leaves because that's going to have more of a raised surface in which to create an interesting texture.
How Hope you had fun gathering some things from around the house and the yard. Once you have, we can get started. I've laid out a brown paper bag on the floor to protect it, and also a paper towel or multiple paper towels, which I will use as my surface to lay down my objects. I also prepared some wet napkins that I'll use for wiping my fingers as I'm using soft pastel for my pigment. You may be using pastel or crayon or graphite or pencil or whatever you have. I also have the spices, so that can also be pretty messy. So it's good to have things to wipe your hands off with. So yeah, let's get started. So first, let's lay out some objects that we have found. Here's a leaf. This is the back side of the leaf, facing upward. I also found some string. I'm going to lay some of this out. And remember, this is a highly experimental process, so don't be too attached to the result. We just want to see what kind of textures we're going to get from these objects. There are a few things. You can make a design, or you can just think of it as sort of like a scratch test, exploring different textures. And then you're going to lay your paper on top of the objects. I have this rice paper that I'm going to use, which is really nice because it's very thin, and so it will pick up the texture nicely. But you're probably just going to have regular paper at home, which is totally fine too. That's a great material. Or maybe even white butcher paper if you have it. Okay, so let's get started. So I've laid out the objects. I have my substrate, my paper, or it could even be some old sheets. And let's see. Okay. Just going to grab a color and start to trace over the object. Rubbing over the object. I can see some really nice leaf veins coming through here. Very nice, beautiful. Okay. So that's using the soft pastel. I think I want to try the graphite to see what happens with that. Go over the rubber band with the graphite. Just going around the object. Holding down the paper with one hand and then doing the rubbing with the other. So you can see I'm just using the side of the pencil. If you use a crayon, you can also use the side of the crayon, removing the paper part. Or if you use a pastel, of course, you'll be using the side of the pastel, or chalk, or charcoal, whatever you might be using. Okay, that's pretty cool. Okay, I'm going to try to also introduce maybe some other materials here. Let's see. Okay, well, I want to experiment with the turmeric. So I'm just going to dip, actually I'm just going to take a pinch of the turmeric and I'm going to rub it over this paper clip here. And just transfer the pigment to the paper, rubbing over the paper clip. And you can see that it's really emerging very nicely. And I'll show you this when I'm done. And please feel free to do this with me if you know all your materials together. Very nice. The turmeric is just gorgeous. It produces a really gorgeous yellow. Okay. So what's next? Let's just introduce some different colors here. Now I'm tracing over the twist tie, which creates a really cool line. And I also have this rope that I laid out. So let's see, what kind of colors do I want to use for that? Let's see, green. Green, tracing over the rope. You can see I'm just holding down the paper with one hand and then doing the rubbing with the other. Helps kind of position things. Don't be too concerned if you get some overspill. That's the charm of it. It's not going to be a perfect clean line. There's going to be kind of some residual. There we go. Cool. Okay. Alright, and there's still the comb. So I'm going to reintroduce maybe some of this pink to get more harmonious composition. But don't worry about composition too much initially. Maybe you're just experimenting and seeing what these shapes and textures are. And then later, if you like, you can go back and make another design altogether that's perhaps more planned. But right now, we're just seeing what happens. Kind of shapes emerge here, the textures. Okay, cool, that was fun. So I'm just going to wipe my hands and let me show this to you. That's what came out with that little exercise. You see all the shapes and the textures. You see the turmeric rubbing? Let me get a little closer so you can see. So that's a twisted paper clip. The turmeric transferred to the paper and made this beautiful yellow color.
Finally, I want to close with showing some samples to hopefully inspire you. Do you recognize this shape? Do you remember what that is? That was a twisted paper clip, so I traced over it again and again using turmeric. And I clustered it together to create the canopy of a tree. And then, I don't know if you can see this squiggly line here, that is actually the tracing of a twist tie. And then I overlapped it with some colored pencil to further define the tree-like shape. So you can do that. You can start to mix media. I also wrote a word on my art, which I often like to do, setting the intention of adventure. So maybe there's an intention that you want to think about in relation to your rubbing. For me, this was a new adventure, so I wrote adventure. It's also good to sign your art if you can remember to do that. That's one sample. Here's another one. Can you guess what this might be? Does this shape look familiar? Yeah, those are scissors. And the orange shape is actually the edge of a piece of paper that I traced over. This one's a bit more chaotic. Do you recognize any of those shapes? So this is actually a credit card, that purple outline, and I'm using the edge of a piece of paper to make the yellow. So these are all just experiments. You can see they are kind of messy. They're not necessarily like perfect in any way. It's just an exploration. This is a leaf that was traced. You can see some of the patterning. Here are more leaves, and this time I chose to use different colors, rubbing over it. And then here, this isn't exactly a rubbing, but I was experimenting with turmeric and also coffee grinds, tea bag, cinnamon and pepper to see what kind of pigmentation I would get from that. There's another sort of messy sample of leaves. And then just experimenting with pigment, with wet coffee grinds and dry coffee grinds and how they're different. Lipton tea, what that looks like, and cinnamon. So it's quite subtle, but they are different. They're all different shades of brown. Here's a graphite rubbing of a leaf. Back to this sample, do you recognize what some of these shapes might be? What does that look like? Yeah, you guessed it, that's the rubber band. That's a rubber band curling onto itself. And I use it as a repeating element in the design. And the larger swirly shapes, yes, that's rope. And you can see I've traced over it in different colors. And I even use cinnamon to fill in some of the shapes. So feel free to get experimental, see what you might find in the kitchen, around the house, for rubbings and also for pigment.
Thanks for joining me today. I hope you had a good time. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and share it with your family and friends. For more videos like this, go to ArtsWestchester.org. My name is Lana Yu.